Thanks, Austin, for gathering us all here today. Huge congratulations for imagining SeedAI and kicking off such an exciting and ambitious agenda today. We're all thrilled to help. I'm Meg King, Director of the Wilson Center's Science and Tech Innovation Program. Our technology labs provide congressional and executive branch staff with interactive learning experiences to understand how technology functions and give them access to a broad range of experts, including machine learning researchers from around the world. Graduates of our AI lab are responsible for shepherding into law the National AI Initiative Act, which called for a roadmap and plan for the National AI Resource Task Force. Wow, it's a mouthful. And that's why we all love acronyms in this country, in this city. It began examining the most effective way to make resources available for AI researchers around the country earlier this year. The idea is that if organized, the U.S. could strengthen our world-class innovation ecosystem by better supporting fundamental AI research and increasing the number and diversity of AI researchers and organizations. The NAIRR, depending on who you ask, could break down today's barriers to better AI research, especially access to computational resources and data, and set the stage for building up broader AI opportunity, including for underrepresented communities. Joining us panel today is Anna Kumar, who is a Bren Professor at Caltech and Director of Machine Learning Research at NVIDIA. She was previously a Principal Scientist at Amazon Web Services and has received several honors, including the Alfred P. Sloan Fellowship, the NSF Career Award, Young Investor Awards from DoD, and faculty fellowships from Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and Adobe. Hudan Amar is a policy analyst at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation Center for Data Innovation. Previously, she worked as a senior consultant on technology and risk management in London and as a crypto economist in Berlin way before it was cool. And just in case you all don't know, SeedAI has its own NFTs, which is amazing. And I wanted to make a joke about what does SeedAI and Martha Stewart and Snoop Dogg have in common? They all have NFTs. So welcome, let's get to it. So what is the National AI Research Resource? Why do we need it? And what does success look like?
Yeah, I think the National AI Research Resource, or I'll continue to say NAIR from now on, is really important. And to me, we're already behind in terms of the need of such a resource. Right? So if you look at the largest AI models over the last 5 years, they've grown 30,000 times. Now the model sizes are doubling every 2 months. And almost all of it is happening in industry, and especially mostly in big tech and few companies. And that's where there is such a big gap between the development and the speed of progress happening in industry versus the resources available in other sectors. Wearing my Caltech hat, when I joined Caltech in 2017, I saw that there was so much need for AI all across campus. I founded AI for Science as an initiative to bring AI researchers closely collaborating with researchers in all different sciences, and also brought cloud computing credits and got so many proposals, right? And many of them then went on to win big awards like the NASA SphereX. So what we need are even the seed resources, which is apt given that this is the SeedAI event, to get these ideas started and happening at all levels. We have really bright undergraduate students joining us for the summer research program, including the WAVE program for diverse candidates joining us in different labs across campus. And what's missing there is an easy way to quickly access AI resources, right? And it's not just the raw computing, but also engineering help. When I launched the Cloud Credit Program at Caltech, I realized that it's not just a matter of handing over credits. What they need is a really close discussion of what is the appropriate resource, right? How do I get started? What are the right data pipelines? And speaking of data, indeed, one important part of NAIR is building these data repositories. And we need to ensure that we don't treat all of it as a one-size-fits-all. Because, there is the people-centric data where we need to be sensitive. We need to develop methods like federated learning In fact, at NVIDIA, we've been working on federated learning for healthcare applications. One of the first COVID models we built for, assessing lung health was using federated learning from data from many different hospitals. So these technologies should be further developed, research should be further enabled to understand differential privacy. And lastly, the big elephant in the room, the bias. The bias is such an important and a hard problem to solve. Many years ago, after leaving Amazon Web Services, I urged the company to stop selling to the law enforcement face recognition and other technologies because I felt it was not yet ready for such sensitive applications. And we've come a long way since then. Now, these services are no longer sold, and there is a lot of now need to think about what is the right testing methods, and that's where the NIST and other organizations are very much involved now in understanding what would be the right way to even test face recognition, right? Because what would be the needs for law enforcement would be very different from, let's say, access to a building. So we have to understand these testing procedures as well, and that's part of the NAIR, to not only have data requirements, but also testing requirements, reproducibility requirements, making that research open and accessible, and so that others can build on it. I think these are all aspects we need to think about. And we also need to think about data beyond people-centric data, right? If you think about science, there is so much data now by genomics or from the particle accelerators. How do we centralize that? How do we make the best use of data? And so there, we really need very fast data pipelines to easily share across different computing facilities. And lastly, the actual computing facilities, right? It should be a hybrid multi-cloud and a combination of on-premises and the cloud coming together. And also a really strong assessment of the current federal resources. We already have many supercomputing facilities. Are they being used efficiently? How do we satisfy the many diverse needs? Because so far we've been focusing on very large computing needs, which is important because we do have a lot of good science, important science solved by the larger supercomputers. But there are also so many needs that are small amounts of computing, like I mentioned, whether it's high school students through AI for All working with researchers or undergraduate students and the educational needs. So we also need to be mindful of such a combination of diverse needs.
Thank you. Oden, you study these issues, but you also interact with policymakers on a regular basis. Tell us, from your perspective, how do policymakers need to think about the evolution of this roadmap and this implementation plan, and why does it matter from your perspective?
Thank you so much. I would just first say that I totally agree with what Anima said, and just to build on that first a little bit, there are really two federal agencies from an AI compute perspective that are really, provide access to the systems that AI researchers need, DOE and NSF. And DOE provide access through their Insight program. And if you go on their website and you look, it says, we only are able to satisfy 1/3 of the demand that we get for access to the, leadership class systems. And in a report I did last year, I was looking at NSF, and they provide access through their Exceed program. And the difference between AI or kind of demand for access versus supply has been growing, increasingly over time. And, in 2019, it was 1/3 again for NSF, and that's just what's being requested. So at least, 2/3 of AI researchers don't have access to the resources they need. And from a policymaker's perspective, that's, problematic because it inhibits our ability as, in the United States for US competitiveness and, for general innovation. And to your question about how policymakers should be thinking about this, I think it's really important to distinguish between innovation and competitiveness, because we often use these terms interchangeably, but they actually mean distinct things. Innovation is, developing a new product or a new organizational method, whereas competitiveness is the ability for an economy to, compete in global markets regarding its traded sectors. So, for example, think about the use of AI for haircuts, right? If I got an AI system that told me if I should shave my head or if I should get a small pixie cut, neither of which I should get, but versus an AI system that's being used to with NVIDIA chips to how can we best create chips, which is another use case. Both of those examples are innovative. Both of those would help innovation in the United States. But nobody goes to a different country to get their hair cut. Only AI for chips would be important for US competitiveness. So if you're developing the NAIR for US competitiveness, you would want to prioritize AI for chips, whereas if you're just thinking about innovation, you should treat those two things the same. And I think for policymakers, you really need to consider that difference. And I do think that a NAIR can actually achieve both, but it means that the mechanisms that you're going to achieve those have to differ. Do we need a mechanism that's exclusively for researchers at university so that they can do innovation in any sector, be it haircuts, be it chips, be it in climate for anything, versus do we need to give innovation vouchers for specific traded sectors that speak to a larger competitiveness strategy, and do we have a competitive strategy for AI? And then the third goal is equality of opportunity. Do we need to focus a certain mechanism exclusively for HBCUs and for Hispanic serving institutions and for tribal colleges? These are three separate goals, and we need to think of three mechanisms for this one resource.
Fantastic. So both of you have mentioned access to resources, so computing power and data. Can we talk a little bit more specifically about what that means? Most of the people in our audience know, but for those who don't, can we talk? I love the hypotheticals. Can we talk a little bit about what that really means in practice? Because that means, as we're thinking about, as the White House is thinking about implementation, who gets access and who are they? I think that will help answer that question.
Yeah, I think, that's where it can be a broad, diverse set, right? So far, like if you look at DOE, the computing needs is access to supercomputers and certain amount of time and certain number of GPUs or CPU cores, right? And that's something that, people put in the grant proposal and are able to access and get also support in deploying the models. And similarly for data storage and other needs. So far, a lot of it has focused on the core hardware needs, right? But we also need to think about software and other support. Working with the AI for Science initiative at Caltech, what I realize is there's such a big gap also in terms of if you think about other sciences or social sciences, researchers there, they don't even know where to get started sometimes, right? And how much do they need? How much computing do they need? And how to curate and collect all the data. So that's where, I think, it's one thing to think about competitiveness for a few selective fields, but I think ultimately in the long run, what will benefit is having a broad agenda where, we don't limit these resources to just a few fields, but similar to NSF and other, proposal mechanisms, we evaluate them based on their technical merit, have peers evaluate them, and so computing becomes one aspect of such grant mechanisms.
I totally agree, and I think when we're thinking about how to allocate it, it's also in some ways a cake cutting problem. We have one large single to some extent, but lots of different parts playing a single continuous resource. How do we cut it so that we are maximizing everybody's utility and also kind of minimizing disparate impact? And that's a field, that's an entire field in economics, mechanism design. And so I think it's important to kind of engage with, mechanism designers and other kind of, expertise to kind of see this problem at a higher level. Because I think it can bring kind of analytic clarity to broad policy goals. Because, consider the goal, yes, we want to provide access to the most number of AI researchers as possible. You can actually implement that in two ways. You could say, firstly, I want to minimize the number of AI researchers who have less than some level of AI compute. Or you could say, I want to go to the most needy people first and give them as much as they need, and then go to the next people. Both of those solve that same problem, but you would be giving it to different people, and they come with different outcomes. So how are we going to, which is best, which one do we want to do? And so I think that's one way to kind of frame this question of how do we, provide allocation.
So what capabilities, can we dig a little bit deeper, will the AI research resource provide? We've talked across a lot of sectors, but are there some specifics that we hope to gain?
Yeah, I think the first aspect, as I mentioned earlier, is consolidation of the current federal resources, right? And understanding what their efficiency is, how much they're utilized, and working together, I think, as a private-public partnership, which we've alluded to earlier, and saying, what aspects of the cloud is great versus on-premises, right? And assessing on what new facilities and infrastructure should be built, and how can we make it geographically diverse, and how do we still connect those with very fast interconnects so that data access will be easier. You treat it as one commodity, even though it could be all geographically diverse. And also in terms of the diverse needs, right? So some of them may require many GPUs and a large project versus many of the small projects. You have to also make sure the resource is utilized efficiently. And I think the cloud companies have been having a lot of expertise in managing that, right? Because they are able to serve so many diverse needs. But I think at the same time, when we look at supercomputing facilities, there's a lot of expertise in how they manage research needs, right? Because that's not the same as maybe some of the web apps and other needs that we see that public cloud companies have been really good at. So it should be some hybrid of all the best lessons learned from these different organizations.
I will also say, and he was definitely the technical one, but from the average Joe perspective, I agree we should have, if I have a good idea and I want to use this system, I need to be able to go to it and there should be some kind of mechanism that takes me to the right resource, right? So if it's best for me to use cloud, I need to be directed to cloud because I might not know that. I just have a good idea that I want to pursue. And then this point about efficiency, I think a lot of the times our metrics are how fast is the system. But if I'm doing research and Anima's doing research and my research is really, I need storage, it's really the most important metric for me is data storage, it's not speed. And are we going to be able to, allocate me to the right resource for my particular needs? What are those metrics that we're thinking about? What are the metrics that, AI researchers care about? I know that's very easy for me to say when it's actually a very difficult problem to actually find out because researchers don't know, and I know the OECD are doing work about it, but I thought it was something worth highlighting.
So we spent some time talking about broadly access. Assuming we can figure out the people problem and we can get people to the right place to carry out the right research, what about overseeing the ethical and responsible development of AI once they have access? How are you all thinking about that?
Yeah, and that's such an important question, and it's also really important for having independent research, right, into these issues. As you're aware, all the largest language models are in the hands of private companies, including at NVIDIA, we recently built the largest language model with 530 billion parameters, which I think is a very amazing engineering feat. And we do want to work with researchers in universities to understand the toxicity, the bias that is built into these models. And also, to use these big models as a way to even detect, right? Are they aware of their own toxicity? Or, is it something that they don't understand, right? And if so, if they're aware, can we progressively fine-tune and remove some of these issues? And I think there is so much opportunity here for a private-public partnership to train these large models. Not necessarily release them into the public because there can be a lot of harm from these models, and we've seen all different examples of harm such as deep fake or fake news, right? So we also need to be mindful which ones would be beneficial to completely release into the public versus, similar to IRB or other mechanisms, have ways that researchers can access these models, but not necessarily it should be in a controlled way. And I think with that, we can then carefully study what is the capability of current AI, right? Is language model, for instance, able to understand toxicity? How well can it moderate speech in different contexts? Or facial recognition, like I mentioned earlier, how capable is it under different conditions? For instance, if we want law enforcement to use, especially say in body cams or other sensitive situations, can it really hold up to what can evolve, in real life very quickly, right? So can it actually identify with very high precision and recall? So these are aspects I think we need to have independent testing mechanisms, and that's what is lacking right now. We're, have to take the companies at their word because, we don't have such a mechanism, and that's what I think this resource can be very useful in providing.
I think that, Anima's really covered this distrust of the AI systems and the bias within the AI systems. And then there's also the kind of other angle of, equity of access. Are we ensuring that, all researchers have access to these systems? And also there's a third kind of argument that I saw made earlier this week, which is, by kind of engaging in public-private partnerships, are we, entrenching certain technology companies? And to that I would say, the strength of America has, historically been its public-private partnerships. Consider how we got to the moon. It was, well, I'm British, but consider how you got to the moon. It was the United States government, it was NASA spending tens of billions of dollars, and a significant portion of that money was going to companies like, the rocket that launched Apollo into space. It was IBM who was, doing mission control. It was General Motors who were putting the computer systems. It was Whirlpool who did space food. It's about leveraging and directing private efforts to the public good and for socially, useful use cases. And so the argument that we should not be pursuing the NAIR because, public-private partnerships might entrench big tech is, I think, it's not really considering the wider framing and how this actually will be socially beneficial at a higher level.
I agree, and I wanted to quickly add to another concern, right, that has been brought up, which is that, there's already so much of funding available to AI research versus research in other areas, especially humanities or, say, some of the theoretical sciences, and to which I think NAIR should have a very broad perspective, right? So it cannot be just computer science, AI researchers who would be funded with this resource, but ultimately, highly interdisciplinary. For instance, at Caltech, I work with social sciences professor to understand hate speech, trolling, and fake news, right? So, and I think that's where we really learn important lessons in terms of how to manage this really complex problem.
Speaking of management, you have been on the technical grounds. So how would you hope that the NAIR would be managed from a government perspective? And also, there's funding associated with this, but there is never enough funding, as you point out, for either the computer sciences or the humanities. But how are companies thinking internally now about dedicating resources? Because there's a bottom line after all. Can you just tell us how you're thinking about that from the industry perspective, and then how would you hope that this resource would be managed?
Yeah, I think that's where I think Hodan made very important points, right? Like there are different ways to allocate resources, and what does success look like, and what does equity look like, and that's where I think especially programs like NSF that have focused on having good technical merit, having peer evaluations, but also ensuring, say, like summer research funding for undergraduates, or having historically underrepresented communities, having sources of funding. So it has to be that multi-pronged effort, right? And we certainly need to have like an ethical statement, or, similar to IRB, like, what is the unintended consequences of this research? Is this being done responsibly? who will this be released to, right? I mean, can these models be misused if they are fully released to the public, right? Or how, if they're not released to the public, how will other researchers be able to utilize this? And that's when I think, it really depends on the area, right? Like I said, people-centric data, we have to differentiate that from other kinds of scientific data where, it may not be as sensitive to just openly share it. And I think that's very important in terms of the management that, US has been really successful in funding research for many decades now, DOD, DOE, NSF, all these different organizations. And so we want to think of this resource as a way to augment many of those programs as well as also be some of the new programs launched as a part of it.
To this question, in the comments that I submitted to OSTP and NSF, I give this analogy of, and this is just an idea, but consider public broadcasting. We wanted each of the 50 states to have, all Americans to have access to radio, and so, that's the role of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. It doesn't own any of those radio stations in each of those places. It just takes federal funds and it ensures that there is kind of equitable access around the country. So could we think of something similar for the NAIR, where we have a private kind of independent agency that's not really affiliated, or it sits outside of direct government, but it kind of takes federal funds and it kind of spreads it to systems around the country. I haven't done it justice, but the idea is fleshed out more in the comments.
And I would add to that, I think the Department of Commerce seems like a great home, given all the history and also the National AI Initiative being there and the NSF being there, right? So having a new office there while working closely with all the other entities could be a great one.
Thank you. You've mentioned data and sensitive data. Can we talk about how privacy concerns should be addressed? There is some news recently where some neural nets had been reversed, and you could identify some of the original people and who they were that were used to train the neural nets. We have a huge problem just on simple networks, keeping data secure. How are you thinking about that for the NAIR? And that relates to trust, because the public will need to be able to trust in this resource.
Yeah, indeed. And that's where NAIR has an opportunity to establish new standards, right? Because in a way, there's already so much harm done because we have lots of data sets that are public or were public where it was collected without the consent of people in those data sets, right? And it was also highly imbalanced, especially in terms of gender, race, age, and other characteristics. And then those models have been used by companies to propagate bias. And so we need to now kind of take a step back and say, what if we were to start today from scratch? How would we create these data sets, right? And what is even the limitations of current data sets? Because, for instance, there have been like celebrity data sets, right? Because it's very easy to take lots of pictures of celebrities in different contexts and use that as a way to train facial recognition models. But certainly that does not represent all of the demographics or even the lighting and other situations in which you might use them. And so we need to now ask, then what would be the gold standard data set for this? And the NIST is working on these issues. So NIST, I think, would be a great partner to, take a look at, different data sets. Even ImageNet people have, which is the most popular data set, by the way, and the first one that launched this whole field. People have found like biases, for instance, if you look at not just bias in one characteristics, right? You can ask, okay, male versus female, how many, what is the balance here? But if you look at computer programmers who are male versus female, it's highly skewed. And then if you further ask, darker skin tone and age beyond 60, you may not even find one example, right? So this intersectionality is much harder to think about. And on these imbalanced data sets, how do we then train AI models? What are the methods used to do it? And so we can use these as test beds to understand, can we do fair AI even in the presence of imbalanced data? And what is the role of algorithmic bias? Because we talk about algorithmic bias and amplification of bias. Because even when the data is imbalanced and we train algorithms only thinking about overall accuracies, we're in a way making trade-off against the minority populations in that data set. And so this kind of research, the NAIR can really help us further do. But at the same time, right, how would the models be utilized based on such people-centric data? I think there has to be controls. And that's where we have to, be mindful of, is this okay to release to the public, or is there special access programs? So academics can still apply to access the models, they access the data, but similar to IRB, they would have training and they would be, told what they can do with the data. So I think making it seamless, but at the same time controlled, I think is a great strategy.
I would just add as well on this point of kind of responsible research. I hope that we consider responsible research more broadly, because I think that, there is this focus on AI research, but AI research, is within all the different kind of, fields. So AI research in agriculture, AI research in medicine, and, in a recent kind of audit, NSF flagged the gaps in general responsible research. So it's not enough to just, focus on making sure that AI research is responsible, because if responsible research point blank period is not working, then it's not, going to be effective. So, can we think about this holistically? Where does AI research play into this? But if we're doing responsible research, we should be doing responsible AI research. Not we're doing responsible AI research, nothing,
That's a perfect segue to my next question. So trustworthiness in the public and trustworthiness in these models themselves. How do we think about that challenge? Are there techniques that are useful that NAIR could be considering? Does that fit into the standard setting process you were suggesting? How can people think about that? Because there are a lot of the idea of being able to explain is really important to gain trust.
Yeah. Certainly. I think the explainability and interpretability is a huge part, right? And what makes it challenging is these are black box models. If you think of a model with 530 billion parameters, what does explanation mean? It cannot be what each parameter does, right? So that what is the right level of even abstraction to explain is a challenging one, and explaining whom to whom, right? So, and I think it starts, to me, the very first aspect that makes it not trustworthy is we don't understand its failure modes. And even when it fails, it can be very overconfident. And we see in these lots of models, for instance, going back to the face recognition example, it was like recognizing many of the black celebrities and misgendering them, misrecognizing them with high confidence, right? And so this shows a flaw in the way we train models now. And that's where the NAIR can establish now good standards of, is this calibrated, right? And can we think about, similar to safety testing and software testing, can we stress test these models? And so developing these mechanisms ultimately could be useful for all kinds of other companies and standards set in different contexts. And the other aspect to this is also the interfaces. We don't think about user interfaces as fancy research, right? Because it's, something you just kind of provide a screen and that's it. But I think there's a lot of important research to be done. One of my postdoctoral researchers is from that area. And so in terms of how much cognitive load do you want to have on, say, moderators or regulators or auditors, especially on systems like social media where there's just so much of new information coming in. How do you bubble up the most irrelevant aspects? The keywords are evolving all the time. So how do you, showcase the right, relevant pieces of information there? Or in other contexts, like, say, robotic surgery that we are now investigating, right? If the surgeons need to be course corrected with AI, when do you ping them? How soon do you ping them? And I think these kinds of research are also very important. How does that AI interact with humans, right? And we don't have right standards and benchmarks for that. So I think that's an area that I think NAIR should also really think about.
I think there's also the possibility of international data sharing. One of the weaknesses I think of an earlier EU kind of proposal was that to ensure that we're doing trustworthy AI, we're going to train AI systems in the EU on EU data, because we can ensure that EU data reaches these benchmarks. But EU data will never be representative enough for AI systems that are being used globally. And so the NAIR is obviously a US effort, but could we have maybe a repository within that's certain for medicine or medical research, where we're collaborating with other countries and sharing certain types of data. Obviously there are kind of national security concerns for general data or other privacy concerns, but there are certain instances where perhaps it would be more beneficial to work with other countries and other nations on sharing data to ensure that the research that we're doing is as trustworthy as it can be.
Yes, and there are many other countries, including the Japanese, who are very excited about this data-free flow with trust idea. And the Wilson Center has been advocating that under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, there are some amazing opportunities in the digital trade chapter to do such a thing. And we haven't quite gotten there yet, but hopefully maybe the NAIR can coordinate. Any last comments from both of you all? Thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation. Any last parting thoughts?
Thank you, Meg. I mean, this has been really great, and I learned so much from both of you. One last thing I wanted to add was, in terms of the data, right, the federated learning and differential privacy, I know we need research to investigate how much of protection they can provide, but also enable this kind of infrastructure, right? Especially healthcare, federated learning is taking off. So if we can make it seamless for us to put together all the important data to make new discoveries, or especially say with the pandemic, it was so important to early on have good models to understand the lung health, right? So can we in future be very agile but still be very safe with data? I think that's where the NAIR can take the latest technologies, right? So now I think it can leapfrog from many different other infrastructure programs to being completely modern and breaking new ground here. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you, and those are my parting thoughts. Thank you very much, everyone.